I must admit one thing to you. I could never understand how one can love one's neighbor. One can love one's neighbor in the abstract, but at close quarters, it's almost impossible. Those were the words of Ivan in Dostoevsky's classic, The Brothers Karamazov, as he responds to the commandment from Leviticus to love our neighbor. And to make his point, Ivan says that he feels a sense of love and obligation towards the poor, but he cannot love the specific beggars that he meets. How, he asks, can he love a filthy, impolite human being from a world completely other than his own? And Ivan's brother, Alyosha, replies, "The face of a man often hinders many people who are not practiced in love from loving him." Not practiced in love. That's a provocative line. Are any of us really practiced in love? I'd say we actually are. I love my family, and I've had lots of practice. But similarly, friends, colleagues, congregants, teachers, where I get stuck is when it comes to complete strangers. It seems feasible to love strangers in the abstract, but not so much in reality. And there is the crux of the matter. Our neighbors must become more than strangers if we are to love them. And it's not merely that the stranger can appear strange. When Alyosha says that the face of a man often hinders many people, he's speaking of more than someone's literal face. We're hindered by the face of a man or a woman who doesn't share our religion or our race, our income, our philosophy, our politics. These are the strangers, the neighbors with whom we have little opportunity to interact meaningfully. And yet, it's really only through building relationships that we can engender a sense of love and empathy for them. They must not remain strangers if we are to love them. This seems like a good moment to mention Archie Bunker. The lovable, deplorable Archie from the groundbreaking 1970 sitcom All in the Family. He was an iconic example of someone who preferred his tribe, who sought to keep his neighbors who didn't share his ethnicity or race or convictions as strangers. And much of the show's comedy came from Archie's chafing at an increasingly integrated world. He famously invoked scripture to validate his preference for white, blue-collar Americans. And I'm going to share this quintessential Archie quote with you and trust that you will forgive me my really terrible Archie Bunker imitation, especially this close to Yom Kippur. But he said, "You know the story of Noah's Ark there, don't you? You know how the animals came up the gangplank and into the ark? They came in twos. The sames with the sames, and the difference with the difference. The lion, he came up with the lioness. And the tiger, he came up with the tigress. And the zebra, he came up with the zebrella. And the elephant, he came up with the, I forget the term, but the point I'm trying to make is that the elephant didn't come walking up with the Jew." And yet, even a character as extreme as Archie was changed when his neighbors became more than abstractions. You'll remember his relationships with the Jeffersons, with Maude, with Stretch Cunningham, his best friend who ends up actually being Jewish. Ultimately, he saw the faces of his neighbors and was moved to acts of empathy. But it could never have happened if he wasn't forced to meet face to face people he felt were too different. And it turns out that life imitates art in this case, as social scientists have shown. Robert Putnam, the eminent Harvard professor, suggests that our ability to surround ourselves with like-minded, like-looking, like-thinking people has increased, not diminished, in recent decades, and that this has led to disconnection and a nation of self-interest. He explains the growing opportunity gap in his 2015 publication, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. And one reason he points to is the breakdown of relationships between people from different walks of life. He writes, Americans' social networks are collapsing, and ultimately growing class segregation across neighborhoods, schools, marriages, and probably also civic associations, workplaces, and friendship circles means that Americans are living, learning, and raising children in increasingly separate and unequal worlds. In short, Putnam writes that we find it difficult to love our neighbor because we have little to do with them. If we move through our lives without really understanding or seeing theirs, he writes, we are less empathetic than we should be. Less empathetic than we should be. That's another challenging sentence. Do I lack empathy? If we're serious about self-examination during these 10 days of awe and accounting, do we do an honest inventory of our capacity for compassion? I think we care deeply about the suffering that we see in the world. But if it's in the newspaper or in some distant location, we're often paralyzed by the enormity of it. We ask ourselves, what can I do to help the Syrian refugee across the ocean, or the black teenage boy who's afraid of being confronted by the police, or the nail salon employee just a few blocks away, struggling with inhumane working conditions, even with our compassionate hearts, and even with our desire to do good, even with our hope that we can help our neighbor, we're often uncertain of how to take action. And yet, I wrestle with the question, what if these strangers were known to me? If I knew them, would I do more on their behalf? What if they weren't Syrian refugees, but the family of my Syrian American friend? And what if it wasn't a faceless African American, but my roommate from college? And what if it wasn't a nail salon worker, but a woman from a church whose pastor was a dear friend? If I knew them not as headlines, but as people, would that channel my concern into some deed, big or small, that might improve a life? Would that drive me to find a way to show up? I have a feeling that it would. So the question becomes, how do we put faces on our neighbors? How do we move past our mutual estrangement? Because based on what we know from Putnam's work, we can no longer count on our day-to-day interactions to make these connections with people who are different from us. And this is true even in New York City, where we live simultaneously in great proximity with our neighbors and at a distance between us that often feels insurmountable. In our day, in this time, we have to organize and create opportunities to get into meaningful relationship. And lucky for us, one of the best conveners of these conversations are houses of worship. One story is an example. In my hometown of Chicago, Anshe Emet Synagogue and a black church called Bright Star spent years building bonds between their congregants. And through dialogue, they learned that because of neighborhood violence, kids at Bright Star could not travel safely to the community park. But two B'nai Mitzvah students at Anshe Emet decided that even though it wasn't their neighborhood, they still had an obligation to their peers across town because these were no longer faceless children. They raised money to build a beautiful new playground with Bright Star Church. The synagogue and church gathered youth from both communities to share dreams of what a playground could look like. And then they brought the communities together to build it. And I wish you could see pictures of the new jungle gym. And I wish you could see how working and dreaming together, these communities who share little in common recognize that they share a future together. Setting aside the intractable economic and social gulfs between races and classes, this playground got built, but it would never have happened on its own. The relationship fostering needed to be organized, and it needed to be in person. And America is out of practice at showing up in person. We're accustomed to online activism, where entire movements get organized on Twitter with faceless donate buttons, with crowdfunding campaigns devoid of personal contact. Today, we're more likely to share an article on social media than share an evening in dialogue or a day marching. We've become hashtag activists. And it's not for lack of care. We all care deeply. But these kinds of actions demand less and risk less. They're more convenient. Why go anywhere? We can sit at our laptops and participate as much or as little as we choose. My activism can be as inactive as ordering takeout from Seamless. My generation has learned that we can love our neighbor without breaking a sweat, that we can join a movement without moving. But Judaism teaches that we have to move, that we have to show up, that we have to go. Empathy in our tradition is actually commanded. You've heard the word chesed. It's the Hebrew term to describe acts of empathy in person. Britain's former chief rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, translates the Hebrew word chesed as face-to-face deeds of compassion. And he writes that acts of chesed actually appear at critical moments in our Torah to teach us that societies are only human and humanizing when they are built on face-to-face encounters. That the Pentateuch, our Torah, repeatedly emphasizes that we cannot see God face to face. It follows that we can only see God in the face of another. And the great Jewish philosophers, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Buber, Emmanuel Levinas, they all preach this same simple truth, that the moment that our eyes meet another person's eyes, we become responsible for them. That the face of another human being demands that we respond. And I learned this firsthand with Central in August. Last month, a few of us flew to Atlanta to join up with the NAACP's march from Selma to Washington, a demonstration that was meant to call attention to voting rights and racial inequality. And we were asked to march in twos, just like animals destined for Noah's Ark, but no Archie Bunker in this Noah story. And every now and then, someone would leave the line, and everyone else would move on up to fill in the space. And as we found our new marching partner, we turned to them and asked some variation of the question, "Why are you marching?" And then, face to face, I heard story after story that broke my heart. My African American partners shared stories that impacted my view of my country's founding promise of equality, where that's been realized and where that's been wanting, and what it means to be a Jew in the midst of today's tensions. And they learned about Jews and Judaism from me. Most of the African Americans I talk to, I'm unlikely to meet again, but for one scorching afternoon in Georgia, we walked the same road. We each learned about a piece of America that might as well have been a foreign country. It was a reminder of what we gain from showing up. Not only do we see the face of our neighbors and learn that their struggles are our own, we also find their hearts turned toward us as well. Later that day in Atlanta, we gathered at a rally for education equality at the King Center. And the president and CEO of the NAACP, Cornell Brooks, charged his organization to speak out on issues of homophobia, immigration, and anti-Semitism. And when we heard that, we Jews in the room were surprised. Why was anti-Semitism his cause? All oppression has the same root, he declared. And if his neighbor is facing anti-Semitism, that's his fight too. Over time, when we tend these relationships, empathy becomes a habit. And Somerville, Massachusetts is a clear example. In Somerville, different houses of worship, including synagogues, spent years building connections between races, religions, and class by organizing formal opportunities for their members to get to know one another. And these diverse groups gathered in intimate settings and shared their experiences, their dreams, their fears. And seeing each other's face, they found common cause. It moved them to improve their community together. They began by tackling education, and then they worked all together on health care. But one day, the Jewish community discovered that the local town aldermen were being pressured to divest financially from Israel. And they reached out to their partners and found that their neighbors would stand with them. It was not lone Jewish voices speaking against Israel divestment. In fact, the strongest voice standing with them was not the most obvious one. Reverend Herman Hamilton, a local black pastor. In Somerville, long relationships mattered. Somerville citizens created a culture in which neighbors saw each other's struggles as their own. And these ties can't be forged in times of crisis. They need to be carefully built before the storm. Now, building these ties can and has looked differently. In some instances, face-to-face dialogue has accomplished this work. Diverse communities, separated by neighborhood, faith, race, get together, and through sharing stories, they get to know each other. And over time, they often discover common cause. But another approach is called side-by-side dialogue. Here, people of different faiths do social action together. And through volunteering on values that they already share, trust is built. And they come to love one another in action. Both roads weave disparate communities together in empathy. I've heard a stirring in this community. There are teenagers who are looking to do this work through their synagogue. And there are 20s and 30s looking for relevancy in Judaism, and their eyes widen when they hear about the possibilities. And there are adults in our community stretched thin by jobs and family and obligations who are still, despite all that, looking for a chance to show up if we called them. And there are retirees looking to Central to make an impact and change our world. We've begun to ask, what could this look like at Central? We're going to have to answer that question together. But one starting place might come from the Reform movement. They're currently exploring how we as Jews can collectively seek out the faces of our neighbors and work together to repair the brokenness that we see around us. In fact, there will be a conversation convened at this year's Movement's Biennial, which is the congregational gathering that takes place in November. So if you're planning to attend, then join us for this conversation. But if you're not, don't worry. Keep your eyes and your ears open. Central will share with you what we learn and what opportunities will exist for us to educate ourselves and find our own ways to show up. Martin Buber wrote that each of us walks through life encased in an armor. And this armor shields us from the storm of strangers, demanding that we meet their gaze and recognize their needs. This armor ensures that we do not see their eyes, pleading that we relate to them, respond to them. Buber writes that the armor whispers reassuringly, "It's just the world. Nothing is required of you." It's a necessary armor. The world is too full of faces to walk about unprotected. And yet, we stand at a moment in the year that summons us to strip off our armor and lay ourselves bare. And standing here, vulnerable and exposed to the summons, we ask ourselves, whose eyes could we meet? If we seek out the faces of a community of strangers, what might we find? Will there be moments of heartbreak? Will there be moments of tension? Yes. But there will be eyes brimming with hope, and lives touched by friendship, and hearts marked by love. May we cast off some of the armor this coming year and allow faces to penetrate our hearts and stir our souls.